When people say they'll start next year, it rarely comes from laziness. More often, it comes from cognitive overload. Modern life demands constant decisions, financial, professional, personal. And when the system feels overwhelming, the brain looks for relief. Postponement becomes a form of self preservation, but the cost of delay is rarely neutral. Over time, it compounds in quiet but powerful ways. From a systems perspective, this behavior is entirely predictable. Humans are not wired to optimize long term outcomes in environments filled with uncertainty, delayed feedback, and abstract risk. We evolved to respond to immediate threats, not gradual erosion. Financial instability doesn't usually announce itself with a single dramatic event. It emerges through small mismatches between income, expenses, and risk exposure that quietly accumulate. By the time the damage becomes visible, the system has already drifted far from stability. What makes this particularly dangerous today is that the surrounding environment amplifies the cost of delay. Labor markets are more volatile, health expenses are less predictable, credit is easier to access but far more punishing when misused technology accelerates both opportunity and error. In this context, waiting is not neutral. It is a decision that allows external forces to shape outcomes by default. There's also a structural illusion at play. Many people assume that financial progress requires a dramatic change, a higher salary, a market rebound, or a major lifestyle shift. In reality, most long term improvement comes from small, early adjustments that compound quietly. Just as compound interest works in investing, compounding works in behavior. Small decisions repeated consistently create stability long before they create wealth. What's often missed is that the cost of inaction grows nonlinearly. A missed contribution, an unmanaged bill, or an unexamined habit doesn't just delay progress, it increases fragility. When shocks arrive, job disruptions, medical expenses, economic slowdowns, people without buffers are forced into reactive decisions. That's when high interest debt, stress driven spending, and long recovery cycles take hold. This is a moral failure, it's a design problem. Our financial systems rarely guide people toward resilience by default. They reward short term consumption, penalize uncertainty, and assume a level of financial literacy that most people were never taught. And the result is a population constantly playing defense. Starting earlier doesn't require perfection, it requires orientation, a willingness to look clearly at where things stand. Even if the picture isn't comfortable, progress begins not with ambition, but with visibility. Once you can see the system you're operating within, you regain agency. And when enough people do that, early before pressure forces their hand, the results compound in ways that are both measurable and transformative. That's why timing matters, not because January is special, but because delay quietly transfers control away from you. When people struggle financially, the explanation is often framed as a personal failure, not enough discipline, not enough knowledge, not enough willpower. But when millions of people experience the same outcome simultaneously, it's no longer an individual problem, it's a systems problem. The truth is that most financial behavior is shaped less by conscious choice and more by the structures surrounding those choices. Modern financial systems are designed for efficiency, not clarity. Products are layered with complexity, incentives are misaligned, and responsibilities pushed downward onto individuals who are given limited tools to manage that complexity. The result is a persistent mismatch between how people think money works and how it actually behaves over time. Consider how income flows today. Many workers receive pay irregularly, deal with fluctuating schedules, or rely on multiple income sources. At the same time, expenses are rigid and predictable. Rent, insurance, utilities, subscriptions. This mismatch creates friction. When income is variable, but obligations are fixed, people naturally turn to credit to smooth the gap. Over time, that temporary solution becomes structural dependence. Technology has amplified this effect. Financial apps make spending effortless, nearly invisible. One tap replaces the physical friction of cash. Subscription models turn one time decisions into recurring drains. Buy now, pay later tools shift future consequences into the background. None of these are inherently bad innovations, but collectively, they bias behavior toward immediacy rather than durability. At the same time, many institutional incentives quietly work against long term resilience. Employers may offer retirement benefits, but rarely ensure employees understand or use them. Financial products often reward short term engagement rather than long term stability. Even well intentioned policies assume a level of attention and literacy that most people navigating busy and uncertain lives simply don't have. This is where behavioral economics becomes essential. People don't fail to act because they're irrational. They act rationally within constrained environments. When attention is scarce, complexity rises and stress is constant. The brain prioritizes relief over optimization. That's not weakness, it's biology. Systems that ignore this reality inevitably produce fragile outcomes. Another hidden factor is time horizon compression. When people feel economically insecure, their planning window shrinks. Long term goals like retirement, emergency savings, or skill development feel abstract compared to immediate needs. This short termism isn't a lack of foresight, it's a survival response. And once that pattern sets in, reversing it requires more than motivation, it requires structural support. What's particularly concerning is how invisible these dynamics are. And from the outside, someone may appear financially stable, decent income, acceptable credit score, steady employment, but beneath the surface, small imbalances accumulate. A missed employer match here, a high interest balance there, a lack of liquidity when something unexpected happens. Over time, these frictions compound into fragility. The critical insight is this: financial outcomes are not merely the sum of individual choices. They're shaped by the architecture of the system itself, by defaults, incentives, friction, and feedback loops. When those elements are misaligned, even highly capable people struggle. Understanding this reframes the challenge. The goal is not perfection or control, it's to redesign personal systems so that good decisions are easier than bad ones. When structure supports behavior, progress becomes sustainable. And when enough individuals operate within better design systems, the collective outcome improves quietly, steadily, and at scale. When people hear the word savings, they often think of it as a moral achievement, proof of discipline, or restraint. But from a systems perspective, savings are something much more practical. They are shock absorbers. They reduce volatility in a world that increasingly delivers it. Liquidity is not about wealth, it's about optionality. It gives individuals time, flexibility, and the ability to make decisions without panic. There's also misconception that holding cash is inefficient in purely financial terms. That can be true over long time horizons, but resilience has value that spreadsheets don't fully capture. Liquidity reduces the need for high interest borrowing. It prevents forced selling of long term assets at the worst possible moment. It buys time, and time is often the most valuable asset of all. This is why separating money by purpose matters. When every dollar sits in one account, it becomes psychologically interchangeable. And that makes it harder to protect reserves meant for emergencies or long term goals. Simple structural separation, even if the total amount doesn't change, creates clarity and discipline without requiring constant willpower. Systems work best when they reduce the need for self control rather than demand more of it. Importantly, resilience isn't about hoarding. Excess cash sitting idle indefinitely can represent lost opportunity. The goal is balance, enough liquidity to absorb shocks, paired with intentional deployment of resources toward long term growth. That balance shifts depending on life stage, income stability, health, and external conditions. There is no universal number, only an informed range. What's often underestimated is how quickly stability compounds once it begins. When people stop operating in survival mode, they regain the ability to plan. Planning leads to better decisions. Better decisions create momentum. Over time, that momentum becomes durable progress. Financial resilience isn't built through dramatic moves. It's built through quiet ones, small buffers, clear boundaries, and systems that work even when attention is limited. In an uncertain world, liquidity isn't a luxury, it's infrastructure. Most financial stress doesn't come from long term poverty, it comes from short term instability. A medical bill arrives early, a job ends unexpectedly, a car breaks down at the wrong moment. These events aren't rare, they're inevitable. What varies is whether someone has the buffer to absorb them without cascading consequences. And when that buffer doesn't exist, even modest disruptions trigger high interest debt, missed obligations, and long recovery cycles. This is why liquidity matters more than optimization. Many people are encouraged to chase returns before they built resilience. But money that is theoretically working in the market can help you when your rent is due tomorrow. Liquidity is the bridge between income and uncertainty. Without it, every setback becomes an emergency. The concept of an emergency fund is often presented as a rule 3 months, 6 months, sometimes a year. But the more useful way to think about it is functionally, how long could you maintain stability? If your income stopped today, what decisions would you still be able to make calmly? The goal isn't perfection, it's reducing fragility. Even a modest buffer dramatically changes how people respond to stress. So, what's often overlooked is that liquidity also improves decision quality. When people aren't constantly operating in crisis mode, they make better choices. They negotiate better. They take time to compare options. They invest in learning and health. Scarcity narrows attention. Stability expands it. This is one of the most consistent findings across behavioral economics and development research. There's also misconception that holding cash is inefficient in purely financial terms. That can be true over long time horizons, but resilience has value that spreadsheets don't fully capture. Liquidity reduces the need for high interest borrowing. It prevents forced selling of long term assets at the worst possible moment. It buys time, and time is often the most valuable asset of all. This is why separating money by purpose matters. When every dollar sits in one account, it becomes psychologically interchangeable. And that makes it harder to protect reserves meant for emergencies or long term goals. Simple structural separation, even if the total amount doesn't change, creates clarity and discipline without requiring constant willpower. Systems work best when they reduce the need for self control rather than demand more of it. Importantly, resilience isn't about hoarding. Excess cash sitting idle indefinitely can represent lost opportunity. The goal is balance, enough liquidity to absorb shocks, paired with intentional deployment of resources toward long term growth. That balance shifts depending on life stage, income stability, health, and external conditions. There is no universal number, only an informed range. What's often underestimated is how quickly stability compounds once it begins. When people stop operating in survival mode, they regain the ability to plan. Planning leads to better decisions. Better decisions create momentum. Over time, that momentum becomes durable progress. Financial resilience isn't built through dramatic moves. It's built through quiet ones, small buffers, clear boundaries, and systems that work even when attention is limited. In an uncertain world, liquidity isn't a luxury, it's infrastructure. One of the most revealing features of modern financial systems is how often people leave value unclaimed, not because it's hidden, but because it's poorly integrated into how humans actually make decisions. Employer matches, tax advantages, and incentive programs are often described as free money, yet billions of dollars go uncollected every year. That gap tells us something important. Access alone is not enough. Design matters. From a system standpoint, these programs exist because institutions understand compounding and long-term behavior. Employers use matching contributions to encourage retention and long-term savings. Governments use tax-advantaged accounts to reduce future dependency on public systems. In theory, everyone benefits. In practice, many people never engage. The friction is subtle but powerful. Paperwork, jargon, deferred rewards, and decisions that feel abstract compared to immediate needs. This is a classic example of what economists call present bias. Humans disproportionately value what happens now over what happens later, even when the later benefit is objectively larger. A dollar today feels real. A dollar in retirement feels hypothetical. So when someone chooses not to contribute to a matched plan, it's rarely because they've done the math and rejected it. It's because the system requires attention, trust, and patience at the same time. Three scarce resources in modern life. The tragedy is that these missed opportunities compound quietly. A small contribution not made early doesn't just cost that dollar, it forfeits years of growth, employer contributions, and tax advantages. Over decades, the difference can be life-altering, yet the system rarely signals this clearly or urgently. The cost of inaction remains invisible until it's too late to recover easily. This is where system design matters more than individual discipline. Programs that rely on opt-in behavior consistently underperform. Programs that use automatic enrollment, default escalation, and clear framing consistently outperform expectations. We've seen this across countries, industries, and income levels. When the default is participation, outcomes improve without requiring people to become financial experts. There's also a deeper issue of trust. Many people hesitate to engage with financial tools because they've seen institutions fail, markets swing wildly, or rules change unexpectedly. Skepticism is rational, but disengagement has its own cost. The challenge isn't blind trust, it's informed participation. Systems must earn trust through transparency and simplicity, not complexity. Tax-advantaged accounts offer another example. They are among the most powerful tools for long-term stability, yet they're chronically underused. The rules feel opaque, the benefits feel distant, and without guidance, people default to inaction. This isn't a failure of intelligence. It's a failure of communication and design. What's often overlooked is how small, early participation creates optionality. Even modest contributions keep pathways open. They preserve flexibility. They allow people to adapt when circumstances change. Opting out entirely closes doors that are difficult to reopen later. The broader lesson is this: financial systems should not rely on constant vigilance from individuals. They should be built to support good outcomes by default. Until that becomes standard, individuals who learn to recognize and act on these embedded opportunities gain a quiet but powerful advantage. In the end, this isn't about chasing optimization. It's about reducing regret, about ensuring that when people look back, they don't uh, a trail of missed chances that could have been captured with minimal effort, attention applied early and consistently remains one of the most valuable forms of capital we have. When people talk about debt, the conversation usually centers on numbers, interest rates, balances, minimum payments. But debt is not just a financial condition, it's a psychological environment. It changes how people think, how they evaluate risk, and how they experience time. And once that environment takes hold, behavior shifts in ways that are both predictable and difficult to reverse. One of the most misunderstood aspects of debt is that it often begins as a rational response to instability. When income becomes uncertain and expenses remain fixed, borrowing fills the gap. Credit cards, buy now, pay later services, and short-term financing create the illusion of continuity. Life can continue without interruption, but this continuity is fragile. Over time, the cost of borrowing accumulates, and what began as a bridge becomes a trap. The data increasingly shows that much of today's consumer debt is not driven by excess or luxury, but by volatility. People are using credit to smooth basic living expenses, food, housing, transportation, rather than to fund discretionary upgrades. This matters because it changes the psychological relationship to money. When debt is tied to survival rather than choice, shame and anxiety replace planning and agency. At the same time, another pattern runs in parallel. A significant portion of households also overspend, not out of necessity, but out of emotional regulation. Consumption becomes a way to cope with stress, uncertainty, or a perceived lack of control. In an environment where many aspects of life feel unstable, work, health, social status spending can feel like one of the few areas where choice still exists. This is not irrational behavior. It's a human response to uncertainty. What makes this particularly challenging is that both patterns can exist simultaneously. Someone may overspend in one area while cutting back severely in another. They may oscillate between guilt and indulgence, discipline and resignation. Over time, this oscillation erodes confidence. People stop trusting their own judgment, which further weakens their ability to make consistent decisions. This is why extreme financial strategies tend to fail. Hyper restriction creates emotional backlash. Total permissiveness leads to instability. Neither approach addresses the underlying drivers of behavior. Sustainable change requires flexibility, the ability to adjust without collapsing into either extreme. Psychological research consistently shows that humans perform best when systems allow for error without catastrophe. When small mistakes are survivable, people learn. When mistakes are punished severely, people avoid engagement altogether. Financial systems often do the opposite. Small missteps trigger disproportionate penalties, reinforcing fear and avoidance. There's also a broader social layer at work. Many people benchmark their success against visible markers, lifestyles, purchases, experiences, without seeing the financial trade offs behind them. Social comparison distorts perception, making unsustainable behavior appear normal. Over time, this creates pressure to maintain appearances, even when the underlying economics don't support it. Perhaps the most dangerous illusion is the belief that financial stress is a personal failure rather than a predictable outcome of structural conditions. This belief discourages people from seeking help, learning new strategies, or experimenting with change. It keeps problems private when they are, in fact, systemic. What breaks this cycle is not perfection, but awareness. Recognizing that behavior is shaped by context allows people to design environments that support better choices. That might mean automating decisions, simplifying options, or setting boundaries that reduce temptation rather than relying on willpower. Financial health improves when systems are built to absorb human variability, not fight it. When people can make progress without constant self surveillance, momentum becomes possible. And once momentum exists, confidence follows. The goal is not to eliminate stress entirely. That's unrealistic. The goal is to prevent stress from compounding into dysfunction. When systems are aligned with human behavior, resilience becomes the default rather than the exception. When people talk about fixing financial insecurity, the conversation often drifts toward personal responsibility or some sweeping policy reform. In reality, the most effective solutions tend to sit in the middle, at the level of systems design. What scales isn't motivation or discipline. What scales are structures that make good outcomes easier than bad ones, even when attention, energy, and time are limited. One of the most consistent lessons from technology and public policy is that defaults matter more than education. When people must actively opt into good behavior, participation remains uneven. When systems are designed so that the beneficial choice happens automatically, unless someone actively opts out, outcomes improve dramatically. This principle has been validated repeatedly in retirement savings, organ donation, and energy efficiency programs around the world. The reason is simple. Humans are not optimized for constant decision making. Cognitive bandwidth is finite. Every extra choice competes with work, family, health, and stress. Systems that respect this reality outperform those that assume idealized rational behavior. The most effective financial tools don't demand perfection, they quietly reduce friction. Automation is one of the most powerful examples. Automatic transfers into savings, automatic investment contributions, and automatic bill payments remove emotion from the process. Once configured, they operate in the background, creating stability without ongoing effort. Importantly, automation also reduces the likelihood of costly mistakes caused by forgetfulness or overload. But automation alone isn't enough. It must be paired with flexibility. Rigid systems break under pressure, especially when income fluctuates or life events intervene. The most resilient designs allow for adjustment without penalty, pauses, reductions, or reallocations that don't trigger cascading consequences. Flexibility preserves trust, and trust sustains participation. Public policy plays a critical role here. Policies that encourage portability, transparency, and simplicity create conditions where individuals can make better choices without becoming experts. Health savings accounts, retirement plans, and benefit portability across jobs are examples of infrastructure that can either empower or constrain, depending on how they're implemented. And when these systems are intuitive and interoperable, participation rises naturally. There's also an important role for employers. Workplaces are uniquely positioned to serve as platforms for financial stability because they intersect with income, benefits, and education. When employers treat financial well being as part of productivity rather than a personal issue, outcomes improve for both workers and organizations. Reduced stress leads to better focus, lower turnover, and higher engagement. It's a rare case where human well being and economic efficiency align. Technology, when thoughtfully applied, can amplify these effects. Data can be used to identify risk early, personalize guidance, and nudge behavior before small problems become large ones. But this requires ethical use of data, transparency, consent, and a clear benefit to the individual. Trust is a prerequisite for scale. There's also a global lesson here. Countries that invest in financial inclusion, digital infrastructure, and basic social protections tend to experience more stable growth when people are less vulnerable to shocks. They're more willing to invest in education, entrepreneurship, and innovation. Stability at the individual level feeds resilience at the system level. What often gets overlooked is that scalable solutions rarely feel dramatic. They don't promise transformation overnight. Instead, they quietly reduce friction, smooth volatility, and create conditions for progress to accumulate. So, this can make them less visible and less celebrated than bold rhetoric or sweeping reforms, but their impact is deeper and more durable. The real opportunity lies in aligning incentives across individuals, institutions, and policy frameworks. When systems reward long term thinking instead of short term extraction, behavior follows. People don't need to be perfect, they need environments that support reasonable decisions under real world constraints. Ultimately, progress at scale doesn't come from telling people to try harder. It comes from designing systems that work with human nature rather than against it. When that alignment exists, resilience stops being exceptional and becomes normal, not because people changed, but because the system finally did. When systems fail quietly, the consequences rarely arrive all at once. They accumulate slowly, often invisibly, until the cost becomes unavoidable. And this is the danger of inaction in financial life. Not that things collapse overnight, but that opportunities quietly disappear while fragility grows beneath the surface. One of the most underestimated costs of inaction is lost optionality. When people lack savings, flexibility, or access to affordable credit, their choices narrow. They take jobs they shouldn't, stay in unhealthy situations longer than necessary, or pass on opportunities that require short term risk. Over time, life becomes reactive rather than strategic. Decisions are made to avoid pain rather than to build toward something better. This erosion doesn't show up immediately in traditional metrics. Credit scores may remain stable for a while. Employment may appear steady, but beneath those surface indicators, pressure builds. Small shocks become destabilizing. Minor disruptions turn into months of recovery. The system becomes brittle. At a societal level, this brittleness scales. And when large segments of the population operate without buffers, the economy becomes more volatile, consumer spending fluctuates sharply, labor markets weaken faster during downturns and recover more slowly. Public resources are strained as more people require emergency support rather than preventative investment. The cost of instability compounds across institutions. There is also a psychological cost that's harder to measure but equally damaging. Persistent financial stress narrows attention, reduces cognitive capacity, and impairs long term planning. This isn't a character flaw, it's a neurological response to perceived threat. Over time, people stop imagining better futures because they're focused on surviving the present. That loss of agency is one of the most expensive outcomes of all. What makes this especially concerning is that many of these consequences are preventable. The knowledge exists, the tools exist, and the data clearly shows which interventions work. Yet without deliberate action, systems default to inertia. And inertia, in an environment of rising costs and uncertainty, is not neutral, it's corrosive. There's also a generational dimension. Financial fragility doesn't, reset automatically. It carries forward through delayed milestones, reduced investment in education, and constrained mobility. Children absorb stress, opportunity narrows, and inequality becomes self reinforcing. The cost of inaction today compounds into fewer options tomorrow. Importantly, this is not about fear or alarmism. It's about realism. Systems that are allowed to drift tend to drift toward imbalance. The earlier course corrections happen, the less disruptive they need to be. Small adjustments made early preserve choice, large corrections made late often eliminate it. What's striking is how often people underestimate their own ability to change trajectory. They assume the window is closed or that improvement requires dramatic upheaval. In reality, most progress comes from incremental steps taken consistently. The difficulty lies not in the steps themselves, but in recognizing their long term significance. Failing to act doesn't just preserve the status quo, it quietly makes it worse. The cost is paid not only in money, but in stress, health, and lost potential. And once those costs accumulate, recovery becomes far more complex than prevention ever was. Understanding this isn't about inducing urgency for its own sake. It's about recognizing that stability is something that must be actively maintained. When systems drift, intentional action becomes the only force that restores balance. If there's a single idea that ties everything together, it's this. Progress doesn't come from dramatic transformation, but from building systems that quietly support better decisions over time. The goal isn't perfection and it isn't control, it's resilience, the ability to absorb shocks, adapt to change, and continue moving forward without constant stress. A pragmatic approach begins with accepting uncertainty as a permanent feature, not a temporary phase. Economic cycles will continue, technology will reshape jobs, costs will fluctuate. Waiting for stability before acting is a losing strategy because stability is something that emerges from preparation, not patience. The people who fare best aren't those who predict the future correctly, but those who remain flexible when it arrives. This means shifting focus away from outcomes and towards systems. Instead of asking, how much should I save? A more durable question is, how can I structure my finances so progress happens automatically? Instead of trying to eliminate every risk, the focus becomes reducing vulnerability, ensuring that setbacks are survivable rather than destabilizing. A resilient system is one that adapts without breaking. It has buffers, not because something will go wrong, but because something always does. It allows for mistakes without punishment and progress without perfection. It evolves gradually rather than demanding constant attention. There's also an important psychological shift involved. Sustainable progress requires replacing judgment with curiosity. When something doesn't work, the response shouldn't be self criticism, but investigation. What friction made this difficult? What assumption didn't hold? What small adjustment would make this easier next time? This mindset turns setbacks into data rather than failures. Equally important is balance. Financial health is not about maximizing one metric at the expense of everything else. Saving without living creates resentment. Spending without structure creates anxiety. The middle ground, where present life is supported without sacrificing future stability, is where most people thrive. That balance is dynamic, not fixed. It evolves as circumstances change. Over time, these small, thoughtful adjustments compound. They reduce stress, expand choice, and create momentum. The benefits may not be dramatic in any single moment, but they are durable. They persist through economic cycles, career shifts, and personal transitions. Ultimately, progress isn't about predicting the future or controlling every variable. It's about positioning yourself so that when uncertainty arrives, as it always does, you be prepared to respond rather than react. That's what real stability looks like. Not certainty, but capability. And when enough people build that capability, the effect extends beyond individuals. It strengthens families, workplaces, and communities. Quietly, steadily, and sustainably, it changes what's possible. When people think about financial stability, they often imagine a finish line, a number in a bank account, a debt free status, or a moment when worry finally disappears. In reality, stability is not a destination, it's a capacity, it's the ability to absorb disruption, adapt without panic, and continue making forward looking decisions even when conditions change. Over the next decade, this definition matters more than ever. Economic volatility is no longer an exception. It's a baseline condition. Technological change will continue to reshape work. Demographic shifts will strain public systems. Climate, health, and geopolitical risks will introduce uncertainty that no individual can fully control. In that environment, stability doesn't come from predicting the future, it comes from preparing for variability. A financially stable person is not someone who never experiences stress. It's someone whose system bends without breaking. They have enough liquidity to respond rather than react, enough structure to prevent small issues from becoming crises, enough flexibility to adjust when life inevitably diverges from plan. This kind of stability doesn't require wealth in the traditional sense. It requires alignment between income and obligations, between risk and capacity, between short term needs and long term goals. It also requires self awareness, knowing where your pressure points are and designing around them instead of pretending they don't exist. What often goes unrecognized is that stability is cumulative. Each small improvement reduces friction elsewhere. A modest emergency buffer lower stress improves decision making. Better decisions create momentum. Over time, this compounding effect becomes self reinforcing. Progress accelerates not because life gets easier, but because you're better equipped to navigate it. There's also a broader implication. When individuals operate from a position of stability, communities become more resilient, workplaces function better, families experience less strain, public systems face less pressure. Stability at the individual level scales outward in quiet but meaningful ways. The most important shift is moving away from perfectionism. Financial health is not about getting everything right. It's about staying engaged, adapting when conditions change, and maintaining forward motion even when progress feels slow. Consistency matters more than intensity. In the end, The goal isn't to eliminate uncertainty. That's impossible. The goal is to build a foundation strong enough that uncertainty doesn't dictate every decision. When people reach that point, they gain something more valuable than security. They gain agency. An agency, once established, tends to grow. It allows people to invest not just in their finances, but in their skills, relationships, and communities. That's how individual resilience becomes collective strength, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through steady, thoughtful progress sustained over time.